Welcome to the world's meeting place. American.
Practically narcotics.
Freedom.
Oh, yes. I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Thanks for joining us, folks. Live today, January 6, 2010. I'm Jack Blood. You're listening to Deadline Live, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, and all of our great affiliates picking up the show. Thank you so much for trusting us for an hour or two a day. But you don't have to trust us. Just listen. Listen, weigh it within your own intuition, your own conscience, and then go check out what we're saying, please. G. Edward Griffin joins us here in the second hour of the broadcast. Today he's been a perennial guest on our program for years. There was a great incident, speaking of Britt Hume, who I met at the conventions in 2004. There was just a great moment in my life where I am interviewing Ed on Media Row under the Fox banner. We were an affiliate at the time. I weaseled my way in to use their facilities there. And I'm interviewing Ed about the Federal Reserve. It was taboo to talk about the Federal Reserve in 2004 when they could do no wrong. And as I'm talking to him about this illegal, usurping cabal of internationalist moneymen, monopolists, none other than Wolf Blitzer walks up on me, stands about 3 feet from me, crosses his arms, looks at me as if he wants to have me killed, looks up at the Fox banner, looks down at me, looks up at the Fox banner, looks down at me. And he stands there for about 3 or 4 minutes listening to the conversation I had with my friend G. Edward Griffin. Of course, he is the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, along with Ezra Pound and Eustace Mullins. Ed Griffin is one of the high priests, if I may say that, of exposing the Federal Reserve and their illegal, unconstitutional act of 1913, which has lorded over us and has controlled our money supply in this country all these years and caused a destitute of problems and freedom-sucking agendas. Ed Griffin just has a storied career. He's influenced everyone from Ron Paul to myself. He joins us on the program today. Ed, great to have you again.
Well, thank you, Jack. It's good to be back.
Wolf doesn't like you.
Well, that's good.
I don't know if he doesn't like you. He didn't like me that day because of what I was talking about, what I learned from your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Of course. He wouldn't like what we were talking about. And if he did, I think we were doing something wrong.
Right? That's exactly right. Thank you for that, Ed. You know, 2009, as we had pronounced it, the year of End the Fed, and it certainly lived up to a lot of that. Have they ever, in your memory, received so much flack from the American people than they did in 2009?
Well, there's no question that they have never received a lot of flack like this, but even more significant that they've never received much attention of any kind, which is much to their liking. They would rather that the American people just not pay any attention to them at all. They like to be invisible. You know, the less you know about the Fed, the less you worry about what they're doing, and they like that.
Yeah, cockroaches don't like the light, Ed.
Good analogy, yes.
Well, that's certainly over now. I mean, they're firmly in the spotlight, though. Amazingly enough, with all of so many Americans and the Tea Parties and the big Ron Paul revolution and all the people you've spoken to over the year, the various congressmen and senators who have taken these guys to task, put them under the hot lights, in official testimony, they've actually gained more power.
Well, yes. It's one of the most interesting developments, I think, of the last few years. And people are beginning to realize, because it's right in their face, that no matter how much public awareness there is or how much opposition there is to these hidden forces, it really doesn't make too much difference because they do have the power. We do not really have representative government anymore. We think we do. We go to the polls and we elect for we choose our candidates, which have been chosen for us. Choose between Tweedledee and Tweedledum. But we get this false impression that we're participating in our own political destiny. But when you come to the reality of the Federal Reserve continuing to gain more power and move in exactly the opposite direction of public sentiment, all of a sudden I think even the common man can realize that his vote doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. No, they just go along willy-nilly. In fact, what we understood through people like Joan Vion and others, what happened at the G20 in Pittsburgh was to hand over our economic sovereignty officially. Now, we know it's been done a long time ago, but officially to hand that over to the International Monetary Fund, who allegedly is under the power of the United Nations, and to set up a cabal of central banks around the world who will regulate on a world scale the global economy. I mean, and this is what EU President Rom Van Puy said is the end of sovereignty and the beginning of world government. And they just come out and admit it.
Yes, but they might as well admit it. More than admit it, they proclaim it now. This isn't something that we are supposed to have anything to say about now. It's done. That's what they're trying to tell us. It's done. Sit down, relax, enjoy it, because it's here.
Gee, Ed, I thought that was all a big conspiracy theory.
Yeah, well, it's no theory anymore, is it?
You know, I've been saying that to my audience for years now. It's not a matter of if it is or isn't. It's a matter of do you endorse it or not.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's not conspiracy theory. It's conspiracy history now. And, anybody with a half open eye ought to be able to see it.
What could be more conspiratorial than a group of international bankers who talk amongst themselves, whose policy never becomes public, who pull the strings and the purse strings of America? I mean, give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes the laws. That's what Lord Rothschild said.
Yes, and it's certainly an axiom. It's true. So the question now, Jack, is what do we do about it? You know, it's done. I think Joan has said it very well. She said it's not a question of when are we going to get world government or if we're going to get world government. She correctly says we have world government. So the question now is, what do we do about it?
I think we name Ben Bernanke the Person of the Year. That's what we do.
Yeah.
All joking aside, we do have the power of the people here. We do have the ability to see these people now, which is something we haven't had in the past. Even though they are threatening us, if we audit them, they'll send the whole thing crashing down around our ears. The whole delicate illusion of our financial system will cause destitution and bread lines across America. But there is something we can do. And I think, one of the things I've been talking about, Ed, is we need to be thinking right now what the appropriate next step is. Rather than just asking to end the Fed and then going, now what? We need to figure out what we're going to fill that vacuum with, and I don't believe when, but if we finally get rid of the Federal Reserve, and we need to do that before they do. Well,
yes, that's a very good observation, Jack. And that's one of my favorite songs I've been singing for so many years, is that it's important to look at issues like end the Fed and get the troops out of Afghanistan and all of these issues, get rid of the federal income tax and all of these things we can focus on. But beyond that, how about some principles? What are our principles? What are our political agenda itself? What are we in favor of? What do we want to see? A better world, not just fighting against the things that have been done to us, but if we had a chance to start over again, which I think we will, how would we rebuild the system? And this is what I'm really delighted to see more and more people turning to that question. Yeah, not what freedom isn't, but what freedom is. Yes, exactly. Uh-huh. And what is it? With all of your vast knowledge and your connections, you understand all the inner workings. What is it? What should we be advocating now to replace these guys with? Because I think we're going to win this, Ed. Well, there's no question. It's going to be won at some point in history. It may not be, certainly will not be the next election. But at some point down the line, it's going to be won. And we need to be thinking now in terms of, what do we replace it with? Well, let me just butt in there, Ed, because it could be now. We don't know. They might just be one bad step away from, well, that's true. As Henry Ford called, a revolution by morning, which, I think would be a good thing. But go ahead. What do we replace them with? How do we propose an alternative to what the Federal Reserve has been doing all these years? Well, I think it starts with an ideology, Jack. It's not particularly a step. What step do we take? How many votes is it going to take? What do we name the new agency? What are the wording? What's the wording going to be of the law? Those, nuts and bolts things are very important, but they all start with a philosophy. What is the proper function of the state? And if we don't start with that issue, then none of these other nuts and bolts are going to go together, right? And so, to me, the answer to the question is we've got to we've got to have a better appreciation for the concept of leaving people alone to direct their own lives and to not use coercion against anybody for any reason except, and be very clear on this, the only reason we can use coercion against somebody through the state is to protect the life, the liberty, and the property of the citizens. Nothing more. And I think once that concept is understood and appreciated, how wise it is, then everything else will go together quite easily, whether it's replacing the Federal Reserve System. If you can't force people to do anything except protect life, liberty, and property, then that means you can't force them to accept paper money that has nothing behind it, can you?
Well, there we have the sticky wicket, don't we? Because the urge to save the world is almost a false front to control it.
Yes.
As Edmund Burke, I believe, said. And these people, I think they actually believe they are saving our life and our liberty and, well, not our property, but our happiness.
I think there's a certain intellectual pride among some of them. They think that they're wise enough to know what's good for mankind, and they probably think that they're doing this for the betterment of the greater number. You know, somebody has to rule, they say. It might as well be them because they're smart. And, if they think that if you just leave it up to the common man, he's going to mess things up really bad. He might not realize the importance of having a mandated health care program, for example. He may not realize the importance of having to buy health insurance that covers only drugs and not vitamins. He may not figure that out. So that has to be forced down his throat. That's their mentality. They think they've got all the answers. And, of course, there's corruption in there, too, because once you have these people with the power to force others to do their bidding, then there's going to be backroom deals and handshakes. We might as well use this power to favor this commercial group over that one, and we'll give you a nice little commission under the table. And that's how all of this fraud creeps into government. Business
as usual. In other words, I think what I hear you saying is, and I'll put it in the words, I'll quote a famous dictator, I don't mind if there's a dictator as long as I'm the dictator. Because they're the good, benevolent dictator. And God forbid, this is another reason, Ed, why we don't want world government to centralize control into the hands of the few, as Brzezinski says in the Technotronic era, these people who are unrestrained by morals or values, because we don't know. Even if all these people were good, Ed, which, we know they're not, but if they were, we don't know if the next Hitler comes in and he's the leader of the world government. And think of how much damage he could do. In fact, that's exactly what Hitler wanted, and amazingly enough, that's just what happened. Yeah, that's right. It's a question of not that we don't know that a dictator will come along. We do know. It's just a question of time. All right. And usually it's the fellow that's already there that we think is a good guy. Yeah, even if you give these guys the benefit of the doubt, I'm just saying, down the road, if you're so clouded by the Kool-Aid that you think these people are good, maybe down the road you'll get a George Bush or a Jeb Bush or a Poppy Bush or again, trying to get to all sides. It seems to me what I hear you saying is we need a radical shift in the way we think about liberty, in the way we think about our country and freedom before we can start deliberating what should be done. Exactly. We have to be clear on our principles because, if we haven't given that a lot of thought, we'll be making a lot of mistakes when we start dealing with issues. So I come back to that same theme, is that we have to be very clear that the proper function of the state is negative, not positive. It's not the great organizer of society. It's not supposed to do things for people. Its only function in the context of a free people, its only function is to protect the citizens from, damage to their life, taking of their life, or damage to their property, stealing their property, or their liberty. That's it. Once it goes beyond that and starts to redistribute wealth or fix things up so that this group of people will be benefited or that group of people will have to pay for the benefits to somebody else, and starts, improving on the natural relationship between people according to some formula which they think is just. Once they are given that power, then it's like a runaway train. There's no place to stop it. It just goes until finally the system self-destructs. Yeah, that's exactly what it seems like, the point where we're at right now. Ed Griffin is with us. G. Edward Griffin. He is the founder of a great organization that I belong to called Freedom Force International. We're going to talk a little bit about that before we're done as well. I just love hearing him talk about, how we can all be together in this without being a bunch of collectivists here, and how, Ed, I've used your decentralize and repeal battle cry here for years and years, and I want to give you credit for that because it is that simple. Last night I went to the 7-Eleven. I had a $100 bill, and I was trying to buy some sundries. And the guy was looking at it. I think it was Pakistani or something. He was looking at the bill, trying to figure out if it was real. And I said to him, well, it's real in a way, but it does say Federal Reserve note on it, so technically it isn't real. And instead of, getting the weird look I might have gotten a few years ago from saying something like that, he nodded and seemed to understand exactly what I meant.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, that's progress, I guess.
It sure is. How do we know if we've reached critical mass, or have we?
Good question. I'm thinking about that. What is critical mass? I don't know.
Take your time.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. I think there is a point of critical mass, certainly. I don't know how you would measure it. I really don't know. I think it would be the point at which the collectivist opponents start to come unglued, and they start losing their grip over the power centers of society, I would think.
Over the power centers, not so much the people, because it seems in 2009 they lost control of the people.
Yes, although sometimes I think, Jack, we get a little myopic because we talk and move among people who think as we do. You go into certain parts of here in Los Angeles, and I can guarantee you could go through 1 million people and not find one that understands what we're talking about.
Yeah, in other words, we live in a bubble, and maybe we're not the best to determine that. But I get out and I talk to a lot of people who aren't, in our movement, let's say, and they seem to understand this stuff. The problem is, Ed, they just don't seem to care as much as we do.
Well, that takes me to my little 3-minute seminar on apathy.
I have 3 minutes before the next break.
Yeah, well, maybe this is a good time. I used to think that people were very apathetic. I became very upset with them. And I'd start to tell them things that, what's going on, what needs to be done, and I'd get that glazed look, and they'd kind of, look like they wanted to just get away from me because they didn't want to hear that. And I thought, how apathetic can people be? And then one day I realized that the problem was myself. It was me, not them. And the reason I came to that conclusion, I think, can best be explained by using an analogy. If we were in a rubber life raft in the middle of the ocean, and we're all alone, and we look over the edge of the life raft, and we see a little stream of bubbles coming up, we know that we're sinking. There's a hole in the raft. Well,
Ed, I gypped you out of 2 minutes here. I'm going to give those to you on the other side of this.
I'll come back to the raft in a minute.
Yeah, please. Folks, don't jump out of the raft yet. Stay with us on Deadline Live. G. Edward Griffin with us. We'll be right back after these important messages. Well, I have one consistent theme every time we have G. Edward Griffin on our program, as we do today, and that is I always wish we had more time, a couple of more hours to talk to him, but you can go to Freedom Force International, you can read his books, you can go watch him deliver his lectures, his public speaking events, and there's just never enough of you, Ed. That's my only complaint. We need to clone you and have about 10 more of you.
Well, you're very kind, Jack. Thank you.
You're very kind, and you have a great way about you that I think, really helps this stuff go down. A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down, Ed, and you're just such a nice man on top of everything else that you're very easy to listen to. Let me let you go back to your life raft analogy.
Yeah, okay. I'll get back into that leaking life raft there in the middle of the ocean. We were talking about the nature of apathy and what causes it, and I came up with this understanding years ago that if we were in this life raft and we looked over the edge and we saw a little stream of bubbles coming up around the edge of it, we'd realize that there was a leak in the raft. Now, this is potentially fatal, and that raft is losing air. So what do? Well, there's nothing we can do, so we would just lie there and sink. We would be the picture of apathy. We would do nothing. But now, if we change the scenario and we look around in the life raft and we see an air pump fastened fastened to the inside and a place to screw it in. Now, all of a sudden, we've got this air pump in our hands, and we've got it screwed into the little valve, and we're pumping away for all we're worth, for hours and hours and hours, if not days, to replace those air bubbles. And all of a sudden, we're activism. We're Mr. Activism, for, the ultimate. And the only difference between those two scenarios is that in the first case, there was nothing we could do. In the second place, there was at least something we could do, and so we were doing it. And I realized that the reason people were so apathetic, or appeared to be, when I was talking to them about all the things that were wrong in the world, is because I had done such a good job of convincing them that there was nothing they could do about it, that it was too late. So naturally, if there's nothing they can do about it, they'll just lie there and sink.
Right.
So I resolved from that date forward to try, at least whenever I'm talking about these issues, is to focus as well on the things that can be done. Now, that makes a big difference. So that's what we're trying to do with Freedom Force International. We have a plan, we've got a strategy, and we know it'll work. It's just a question of getting enough people to do it, and we have enough time to implement it. That's all.
And people can join, they can get your email alerts, and this is the best part about Freedom Force International. You can find other people who can work with you or like-minded. Not that we have to surround ourselves with people who believe what we believe, but they can work with you. And there is some solitude, isn't there, Ed, in knowing that you're not by yourself. There's someone that thinks like you do, that can work with you, and that is in every city, not just in the United States, but all around the world, because it is an international movement. People can just go there, sign up, and find out who's in their area who might want to work with them to expose some of these evils.
Yeah, it's a great morale factor to know that you're not alone. And that's one of the values of Freedom Force, is to participate in a local network where you can meet eye to eye with people of like mind. But more than just meeting and talking and, eating, meeting, and retreating, as they used to say, we ask our people to get together and to assist each other to gain influence in the important organizations, or what we call the power centers of society. To go into politics, for example, to go into the media centers, to try and put on meetings for other people, to go into organizations where people are already there for whatever reasons, and become influential in those power centers. That's how our collectivist opponents have taken over this country.
Right.
And while we sit around wringing our hands and saying, oh, my goodness, what are we going to do? Well, we just do the same thing they did.
Well, I mean, if it works for them, it can work for us.
Of course.
We're, of course, constrained by our values, our morals, and they are constrained by each of them being untrustworthy and stabbing each other in the back. So,
yeah,
there's advantages here to both sides. FreedomForceInternational.org. Go over there, read the Creed of Freedom. I think you should start with that, and then sign up as a member. I don't think there's some dues, but it's nothing that's going to set people back more than a movie this weekend or something, right, Ed?
Well, that's right. And if people can't afford the modest dues, they can come in as a free member. It's not essential that you send in money. The only purpose of the money is to keep the organization growing, and we have a lot of things we want to do that require money. But if people can't afford it, come in anyway. But you don't have to send money in.
Fair to say that the Council on Foreign Relations doesn't like you guys very much.
No, they don't really like us. Well, I'd like to say that, I'd like to think at least, that we are the constructive, or will become the constructive opposite of the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm glad you brought that up, because you see, those people don't do anything as an organization. The Council on Foreign Relations itself is kind of a directorate. It's a network of people who do things in the organizations which they dominate, and that is more or less the structure that we're trying to create.
Yeah. One of the things I often think about, and it kind of goes back to your life raft analogy, Ed, is the misdirected activism of environmentalists and anti-war types. I mean, you really do have to understand a few simple principles, and the fact that the banking cartels, the central bankers around the world, going all the way up to the Bank of International Settlements, their lead chapter, I guess, they fund both sides of the war. So if you're anti-war, you have to be anti-Federal Reserve, don't you?
Well, I would think so, yes. Because the modern wars, at least, Jack, as you know, would be impossible without the kind of funding that is available through central banking.
Why is it that they don't latch on to this, Ed? I know that, the people in the Ron Paul revolution are probably more anti-war than anyone else in this country, no matter who they say they are. Our friends like Cindy Sheehan, they understand all this stuff. But the people, the controlled opposition, so to speak, they just don't really use this as an element to unmask the monster.
Well, you said the magic word anti-war. I don't think that's really the issue. I don't know of anybody that is just anti-war, end of discussion.
Pro-peace, maybe that's better.
Or even that, if somebody breaks into your house and is threatening to kill you and your family, you're not a pacifist for the most part. And so there is, in theory at least, there's plenty of justification for war if it's defensive. But there's certainly no justification for war if it's aggressive, So we're back to my statement earlier that the proper function of coercion is to protect the life, liberty, and property of its citizens, not to go forth and to make sure that they have democracy in their government or that they do certain things, that they share their oil or that, whatever else. No. Then the kind of wars that we're dealing with in the world today are not defensive wars. They're aggressive wars. So I have always said I'm not against war per se. If it's defensive, I think we should be willing to defend our country.
Give me a good example of that real quick, Ed. Do you have one? I'm thinking of General Smedley Butler when he said war is a racket. I would have a hard time coming up with an authentic war that needed to be fought other than perhaps the Revolutionary War.
Well, I think there's an example. And after we got the nation founded, we sort of gave up that principle that war is a defensive enterprise and started to turn it into offensive enterprises to spread our influence and our economic power around the world. So we abandoned that principle of defense. Once we did that, we were on the slippery slope of abandoning our freedoms as well.
Yeah. You can't tell me that we got to go bomb Yemen and yet our borders and ports are still wide open. I have a really hard time with that. And the problem I have is that I use common sense, Ed. That's my disease.
Yes, not very common, though.
Well, I'm going to try to be pessimistically optimistic on that. One of the things I wanted to ask you about before we get you out of here, I'm looking at the whole health care, I call it health care perestroika, because that's what it reminds me of. That's reform, right, Ed? Perestroika.
Yeah.
And this is exactly this whole financial mess, the financial 9/11, I call it, which I think was an inside job. That's easy to prove. Was predicted by people like Gorbachev in the past, and this is how they were going to socialize America and then create this one world order. And I look at this health care thing, and it really has a lot of similarities to the Federal Reserve Act. They've got two similar plans, which they sell as different plans, alternatives, the public option and the single payer. That seems to be the debate with most people. They are what I call opposames. And much the same thing happened to get the Federal Reserve Act through. They had the nationalize the bank on one side and then the Federal Reserve on the other. When in reality they were really the same thing. And the people kind of caught in the middle didn't maybe understand some of these more complex financial issues, and you had Mr. Warburg out explaining it to everybody. When I think, and maybe you would agree, maybe you wouldn't, I think that to legalize freedom, we have to have localization of banks, not nationalization, not international. I mean, the farther we can decentralize these banks, the more they could serve the community in a non-interest lending way so that they can sustain the community and the money can stay in the community. I think the more freedom we have, is that in your mind, a potential viable option to the system we have now?
Well, Jack, I have a kind of mixed emotions on that. First of all, I am definitely in favor of localized government. I think that the smaller the governmental unit, the closer the politicians are to the people, the more chance we have of having a free society. And I think that tends to work also in the field of economics and commerce, although now we're up against another issue, is that should we prohibit banks or should we prohibit grocery stores or automobile manufacturers or any other commercial enterprise? Should we prohibit them from operating nationally or internationally? And I don't think we should, because now that's not the defense of life, liberty, or property. We've overstepped our bounds. I think we should...
Well, I'm not talking about businesses. I'm talking specifically about money-lending institutions. And if there was a bad money-lending institution in my city, then wouldn't that open up in the free market the opportunity for somebody else to do a better job?
Well, of course. And I was gradually getting to that point that I don't think we have to regulate banks in any fashion that we don't regulate any other business. In other words, the only basis I believe that the state has for regulating a business is to make sure that they keep their contracts, that they keep their word, that they don't steal people's property, steal their money, and that they do what they say. I don't see why the bank should be singled out any more than a grocery store, you know? So, if a bank does something wrong, if it loses its money, if it goes out of business, it should fail, like a grocery store would fail. And then somebody else would come along with a better bank or a better grocery store, pick up the slack. So I think the problem is when we start to deal with banks as though there's some kind of a mystical thing that that they have to be treated differently, and then we start to have a certain governmental provisions where we protect the banks and we regulate the banks, and all of a sudden the banks and the government become the same, and that's one of the problems we have right now.
You know, I think of the building and loan and It's a Wonderful Life and how the money from the community, goes to people who need to borrow it and how that stays in the community. And that's kind of, where I was coming. And I think in a way we agree. I mean, I think the only regulation, Ed, needs to be an educated populace voting with their dollars. And then we see the free market actually working. And the people that are unethical will be punished.
Exactly. If they don't keep their contracts with the depositors or the customers, they should be punished because they're stealing our property.
There are over 4,000 non-member banks. The membership, of course, to the Federal Reserve. They are being exterminated right now as we're talking. Is that a way out at all? Backing these people, putting your money into banks that aren't members of the Federal Reserve?
I'm not aware of any banks that aren't totally regulated by the federal government.
Well, I'm not talking about regulation, and of course we need to remember that the Federal Reserve isn't federal or has no reserves. But I mean, there are allegedly, over 4,000. I mean, this number is dwindling down, kind of like the family farm, on a daily basis. And it seems to me that the crisis and the first solution to the crisis was to centralize and to absorb these offending banks, which are the ones, I think, if we look at the statistics, Ed, these are the people that are being closed down on a regular basis and not bailed out.
Yeah, that's right. They're the smaller banks, and they're anathema to the big banks. They've always wanted to get rid of them. So this is the golden opportunity to do that. But I think what we need, Jack, is a separation of banks and state.
Forget the separation of church and state. We need that too, but separation of banks and state.
Yeah,
man, you couldn't have said that better. How do we do that?
Well, we start with the public awareness of the need for it. I mean, right now, most people think that banking is some kind of a mysterious, if not almost a religious institution, and we need government in there, they think. So that we start with educating the people and getting them to realize that banks are no different than any other business.
It's been working pretty good so far, and I think 2009 was a good example of that. Ed, stay with me for just a few more minutes. We'll get you right out of here. I got about 2 more questions for you, and I kind of want to, if you can get a handle on predictions of what might happen here in 2010. I know my listeners would love to hear it. G. Edward Griffin with us, freedomforceinternational.org. G. Edward Griffin with us on the program today. freedomforceinternational.org. Go over there, check them out, read their Freedom Creed, join up, support them. I think that can only really help matters. Please at least check them out. Tell other people about them as well. Ed, you're so generous with your time. I appreciate you being with. I know you're going to go on a sabbatical here in a bit and work on some new projects. Give us your predictions for 2010, though, Ed. What do you see happening this year? And look into your crystal ball for us.
Well, Jack, when you mentioned that just before the break, I pulled up the notes that I prepared for my crash course on money. It was a seminar that I've been doing toward the end of the year. And I dealt with that issue here. I'm not saying this is going to happen in 2010 because I don't know the exact time, but I did deal with the question of what is going to happen if there are no changes. And by that I mean if we don't change the thinking of the people in Washington, if we don't change the politicians, that are running the show in Washington, then, of course, policies are predictable.
Yeah, real change, not Obama change.
Yeah, real change, yes. And so I said if there is no change, we will see a command economy similar to the Soviet Red Chinese model. We'll see further bailouts and transfers of wealth. We'll see further destruction of the middle class, further dumbing down of the population, further expansion of the Social Security and health care system, leading first to their utter collapse because they can't afford it, and then to their transfer to the tax base. We'll see more false flag operations made to look like terrorist attacks to keep the public traumatized and grateful for additional loss of freedom in the name of national security. We'll see the replacement of the dollar by a regional or international currency, an intensification of the Republican versus Democrat charade in which voters believe they're being offered a real choice. We'll see increasing public anger and dissent bordering on rebellion, the implementation of efficient crowd control measures with large numbers of people rounded up and sent to FEMA internment camps. We'll see the disappearance or accidental death of leaders in the freedom movement, and, of course, the final emergence of high-tech feudalism in the form of global government based on the model of collectivism.
Wow.
Now, I'm not going to say that's all going to happen in 2010.
We could avoid that, though. Yeah.
We can avoid it because this is all on the assumption if there are no substantial changes. So we better get focused here, folks, on bringing about some substantial changes in Washington.
Ed, all of that would have happened if we hadn't put up a resistance in 2009. I truly believe that. I know people sometimes feel a little frustrated that we're not accomplishing enough fast enough, but think about how it would be if you put up no resistance whatsoever.
Oh, the game would have been over.
Yeah, the oligarchs are waiting in the wings to be named by the Russian command here in the United States, and they'll be given large sectors of our industry and economy to run it just as they're doing in Russia right now.
Yeah, of course.
I've never asked you about this, I don't believe. Have you written on or looked into the CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Reports? Your comments on that?
Well, Jack, I have looked into it at some length, and, of course, it's shocking. I'm not yet 100% convinced that it is as it appears to be. I suspect that it is, but I need a little more independent verification because most of this information is all coming from one source so far, and I don't feel comfortable with that until I see some verification from at least one and preferably two other sources.
Yeah, Walter Burien is pretty convincing. But
he is pretty convincing.
We do want more sources, and I think he feels a little bit alone that more people aren't looking into it and helping expose it as well. But I'm glad I got a chance to ask you that. Well, Ed, it's just been a tremendous year in 2009. You be safe, okay? We need you here in 2010, and I look forward to a time when we can get together and have a beer and talk more about this. In the legend of Ezra Pound, and here is G. Edward Griffin on the program with us today. Best to you. A Happy New Year to you, Ed, and thank you for spending time with us.
All right. Thank you, Jack, and all you're doing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for being here. FreedomForceInternational.org, folks, and that is certainly something you can get behind. If you're out there looking and maybe a little bit lost and you don't know what horse to back, this is a horse you don't have to actually back and get on, but you can learn a lot from going over there. So FreedomForceInternational.org and support them as I do as well. I'm very honored to be in the Hall of Honor over there, and I think that is at least some verification that the work I've done all these years does amount to something.